قراءة في كتاب صناعة السياسة الخارجية لحماس للكاتب والمفكر داوود عبد الله. تطرق الكاتب لعقيدة الحركة وتاريخها في الممارسة السياسية. حدد الكاتب 3 مراحل في تطور السياسة الخارجية لحركة حماس.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This book, Engaging the World, the Making of Hamas's Foreign Policy, was completed last year in 2020. The idea behind it was to address an area that I felt was not previously done in all the literature that I have scrutinized. Most of the literature on the movement so far has dealt with its ideology, its history, its political practice, its political thought, and its militancy. But this dimension of its foreign policy, its international relations, I felt there was a void, a vacuum that needed to be addressed in order to enrich the literature on the movement. So that was the idea behind the book. It has been divided into 9 chapters. But within that, I identified 3 phases in the development of Hamas's foreign policy. The first phase was during the period 1987 to 1992. In which much of its relations were confined to the regional states, particularly Libya, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jordan. That was in the first phase. From 1992 onwards until 2006, we noticed a development in which the movement it broadened its international relations. The third phase, I should say, however, that this second phase between 1992 and 2006 was influenced by the Oslo Accords. And then the third phase, which is between 2006 right until the present day. Now, the way I went about writing the book was I did identify that and notice that there were certain historical events that occurred throughout the 30-year period of Hamas's existence, which affected its foreign policy and its outlook or approach to international relations. The first of which was a major challenge, and that had to do with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. So I noticed that, I mean, it created a big challenge, a huge challenge for Hamas in 1990. Most of his leaders, or some of its senior leaders, were based in Kuwait. Kuwait was the source. Mind you, this was against the background of the Intifada, which started in 1987. And so how did the movement navigate itself during this crisis? The region was in a state of turmoil. There was a threat of a war, being launched against Iraq. The Palestinian community in Kuwait was a huge community, somewhere between 400,000 to 450,000. In fact, for every 5 Kuwaitis at the time, there were 4 Palestinians in Kuwait. So, in a nutshell, what happened was that the movement opposed, condemned, the invasion categorically, and it became part of the regional effort to prevent a war and to resolve the issue within the Arab family. Ibrahim Goshe, he was one of the first spokesman for the movement, was authorized and mandated to go to Iraq along with regional delegations to try to resolve the matter. So that was its first inroad or foray into, regional diplomatic activities, trying to, navigate, some kind of solution to for the Kuwaiti crisis. There were other, incidents or issues which cropped up during the 38 period, which also influenced Hamas's foreign policy. Let me say at this stage, however, that there were certain guiding principles in its approach to foreign policy. Notable among them was non-interference or intervention in the internal affairs of other countries, non-alignment in regional blocs and alliances, independence of its decision-making, and of course trying to confine decisively stating that it would confine its resistance to Palestine geographically, which was mandate Palestine. So these were the principles which guided its foreign policy throughout. Now, there are two, scholars have identified two schools of thought, two approaches to foreign policy. The idealist approach, which al-Mithali, the sort of moralistic, ethical approach to foreign policy. And then there's a realist school which tended to al-Waqa'iyya, the approach that is more pragmatic, which deals with foreign policy issues on the basis of pragmatism. Now, Hamas has never, announced that it adheres to this school or that school, but we can see from its discourse and its policies that it managed to marry or to blend these two approaches to foreign policy. That is to say, for example, although the movement is fundamentally its tradition is from the Islamic school, from the Muslim Brotherhood, and although you see like Syria and Libya were avowedly hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s, this was just a couple years after Hamas. Hamas was able to work with, and to avoid a confrontation with the Syrian regime of Hafiz al-Assad and later his son Bashar. And so too, it engaged at various periods in that, various times in that early phase with the government of Muammar Gaddafi. So the argument here, the point, the fundamental point here is that although it was an Islamist movement rooted in the tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood, it did not allow that to prevent it from engaging with other governments which were hostile to its ideology and its conduct. So just the third phase in its development after 2006 was, of course, after the elections of 2006, when it won the elections. And that really opened up the international arena for Hamas. It created, a situation where it was able to engage with governments in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in a way that it had not done before. So, for example, South Africa. Oh, let's start with Russia. That came out in one of the chapters in chapter 7, engaging Russia, China, and the global South. That is chapter 7. So what we found here is that Russia, for example, unlike the United States, although it was part of the quartet, they refused to classify Hamas as a terrorist organization. And so President Putin, on a visit to Madrid in 2007, he said, well, you know, we willing to host them and to meet with them in Moscow. This, you know, this was something that annoyed the Americans. It caused great, you know, concern. And the ambassador, William Burns, who was now being appointed director of the CIA, he was then a ambassador to Russia. And he, you know, he implored Lavrov not to meet with Hamas at all. However, that did not happen. The Russians went ahead because it was an internal matter. So we saw, and up to today, you know, Russia still has engaged since that period. Have engaged with Hamas. Now, one of the things I, you know, have other governments, let's go to this, that have, you know, engaged with them after the 2006 period was, let's say, South Africa. First under Mbeki and then Jacob Zuma. High-level meetings. A lot of it was facilitated by ambassadors, South African ambassadors in the region, particularly in Syria, where the leadership was based at the time. So we had visits from members of the political bureau, including Khalid Mish'al, Mohammed Nazar, Abu Marzouk, Osama Hamdan. They all visited at various periods, several visits. I think the high point of this period of collaboration with the South Africans was when the ANC itself, you know, offered to open an office for the movement in Pretoria. This, of course, did not go down well in Ramallah, as well as other Arab capitals. And so that process, you know, that agreement did not bear fruit. It was told there was opposition to it. And this has been, you see, a hallmark of the, you know, Hamas's attempt to engage with international actors, state actors as well as non-state actors, that, you know, because it was not a member of the PLO, and the PLO was the sole legitimate representative, quote unquote, of the Palestinian people, then Hamas found it very difficult. So that was the South African episode. Then we go to Malaysia. Malaysia had, you know, adopted a similar position, and they played a crucial role, you know, in supporting the movement, both politically and economically. We know Prime Minister Najib Razak actually visited Gaza, you know, after the 2012 war on Gaza. So the Malaysian support was very, very, you know, influential, significant, I should say. But there was a difference between South Africa and Malaysia. In South Africa, you had a strong, you know, a Jewish or pro-Israeli lobby in South Africa, which opposed, you know, because at one point there was supposed to be a visit by Khalid Mish'al, I think 2009. And that visit was aborted because of security concerns. So South Africa was quite different. Although both countries offered support, operating in South Africa was not like operating in Malaysia. There was no Jewish or pro-Israeli lobby in Malaysia to obstruct the movement. China was a different, you know, sort of scenario. The Chinese, like the Russians, has never classified Hamas as a terrorist organization. To just wrap up this sort of session, you know, this segment on you know what came out of Chapter 7 and the Global South. We noticed that in 2018, I think this was one of the, you know, the meetings that took place in Russia. I mean, right now, there's a Hamas delegation in Moscow. these meetings were not only, like photo opportunities. There was some measure of political benefits, and I refer to the attempt by the Trump administration to secure a UN vote against Hamas in December 2018. The vote was only 85 countries voted in support of the resolution. About 55 opposed it, and there was several abstinence as well as absentee votes from the session. So in the end, the American resolution did not pass, but both Russia and China opposed it. And this was important because this is one of the fruits of the relationship with the Russians, and it is important to Hamas, for Hamas rather, to have a voice, someone, a country in the Security Council that will stand up on its behalf, will defend it when there is an attempt, to malign, to demonize it, and to sway international public opinion in one way or another, because this has been the policy throughout the 30 years of the US in particular, to isolate the movement, demonize it, and then try to crush it militarily, of course, with Israeli military force. So that occurred in, one of the benefits of this period of engagement with Russia and even China in December 2018. They also voted against the US resolution. So it may seem limited, but these were significant. Now, it is important to note that the fact that 85 countries supported the US resolution, that's an indication that Hamas still has a lot to do to win international support within the United Nations. It has a long way to go still. And the truth is, the United States will not give up. They will not relent. They will try again to, having failed the first time in 2018, that's not the end of the story. They will try again. And so it is important for Hamas to step up its efforts to ensure that whenever such a resolution is brought before the General Assembly in future, that it will be defeated more convincingly. So that's the gist of the broad engagements. Now let's go back a bit to after the second chapter. After the first chapter dealt with the Kuwaiti crisis, then the second chapter dealt with the call to Oslo. Because once Iraq was defeated, the major power in the region was defeated. Several countries which supported Saddam Hussein, like Jordan and the PLO, they emerged from that crisis quite weaker, and so it was politically weaker and isolated. So what happened? George Bush Sr. now, he tried to create, or he announced this, a new world order. He emerged victorious from the first Desert War of 1991, and so what came out of this was a victor's treaty, which started in Madrid and ended up in the Oslo Accords of 1993. Between Madrid and 1993, there were several efforts by the United States to pressure the PLO, who in turn would pressure Hamas to join in this process leading up to Oslo. The argument from the Americans was that if Hamas was brought on board, then the Oslo Accords would seem to have there would be a consensus or universal Palestinian support for it. But Hamas was not interested in this. For obvious reasons. It wanted the total liberation of all the lands that were conquered in 1948. I should explain here between the difference between a political settlement and liberation. While the PLO was pursuing a political settlement, as manifested in Oslo, Hamas wanted to continue its strategic goal of liberation. That's the fundamental difference between the two movements or approaches. So they rejected Oslo, and having done so, that put the movement on a collision course with the United States, Israel, and its Western allies, and that has remained so since 1993. Then we come to chapter 3, which is the episode in Majda Zahur in Lebanon, when in 1992 the Israelis expelled 415 Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives to Lebanon. Time is running out here, but that incident, that episode also influenced the movement. It opened up, channels and opportunities for engagement with civil society organizations and institutions in the West, as well as media institutions. And so that was another turning point in the development of its foreign policy, being able to engage with, international actors and also regional actors, because coming out of Majda Zahur was the strengthening of relationship with Syria. That was a major turning point in the relationship with Syria. Hafiz al-Assad it was said that he was very impressed with the late Abdelaziz Arantisi. He actually went to Damascus from Majda Zahur, and so that was the beginning of that relationship. Then chapter 4 looks at the relationship with the United States. The fact that Dr. Musa Abdul Mazouk was, he spent time in America. He lived there, and then in 1996 was arrested and detained for about 18 months in the United States while he was head of the political bureau, and then the movement had to make changes. So I looked at that episode also, the American approach, this whole thing about eradicating the Islamists and what was happening in Washington. But I think that the significant point I brought out in that chapter was the dichotomy, the difference between the State Department and the Pentagon on approaching Hamas. The State Department had a more aggressive pro-Israeli stand, whereas the Pentagon, their approach was quite different. They recognized Hamas as a major player. They thought it was futile trying to defeat the movement, and they thought it was better to try to engage with them. I just stop here to overcome this. In Britain, several politicians and intelligence officials in Britain, which I addressed in the Europe chapter on Europe in chapter 6. People like Chris Patton, the former EU commissioner, he said, well, Tony Blair was negotiating with Sinn Féin in Ireland, but he didn't want to negotiate with Hamas. What's the difference? And he called on the EU to stop sending money, to the PA and so on. Even Eliza Manin-Hambulla, the former MI5 director, she said, you can't resolve differences through military means. You have to address this issue through political discourse. So there was, differences, although the Blair government, pursued this policy of trying to isolate and to blacklist Hamas. There was significant pushback from senior politicians, former diplomats, and intelligence officials. And the final chapter, chapter 8, the 8th chapter, dealt with the Arab uprisings, the departure from Syria. I looked in some great detail, having interviewed senior members of the movement, included Khalid Mish'al, how, this decision to leave Syria came about, and then, its impact on the movement, the shift towards Qatar, and then the alignment with Turkey and Qatar, after the departure from Syria. So that is the chapters in themselves. I closed off in chapter 9, looking at the external challenges, the internal weaknesses of the movement, and what the future looks like.